Hello, welcome to this video lecture on T.S.Eliot as a literary critic. Eliot is one of the towering and most dominant figures in the literary field of the 20th century. Eliot was basically a classicist. He preferred the classical approach in literary criticism. For Eliot, orderliness was very important in art as well as in literature. Now, Eliot is also famous for his anti-romantic definition of poetry, in which he states that poetry is not a turning loose of emotions, it is an escape from emotions. It is not an expression of personality, but an escape from personality. So let's take a look at T.S. Eliot and his critical concepts. Thomas Stearns Eliot is an American-born British poet, essayist, publisher, playwright, literary critic, and editor. Eliot is a versatile literary figure who occupies a very prominent place in 20th century English literary criticism. A classicist in literature, Eliot questions the basic premises of Romanticism. Eliot's opposition to Romanticism finds powerful expression in his first work of criticism, The Sacred Wood, published in 1920. The most important essay included in this collection is Tradition and the Individual Talent, often considered his first critical manifesto. Now, this essay was earlier published in 1919 in The Egoist. The publication of this essay coincided with the rise of modernism in 20th century. In this essay, Eliot insists on the continuity of literature. The essay can be divided into three parts. In the first section, Eliot talks about his concepts of tradition. In the second section, Eliot talks about his theory of depersonalization. And the third section is a very short summary, a conclusion. So, Eliot emphasizes the necessity of the individual writer discovering his place in tradition, in the great literary tradition, and constantly revaluing the literature of the past while he is in the present. So, the opening argument of the essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, is that tradition is a completed whole. It comprises the preceding creative endeavors, out of which the individual author creates a new work. So, tradition, according to Eliot, does not mean a slavish imitation or a blind or timid adherence to the past. Instead, the concept of tradition involves cultivating a historical sense. Now, this historical sense means a perception not only of the pastness of the past but of its presence. So, tradition, according to Eliot, is the means by which the vitality of the past enriches the life of the present. So, Eliot emphasizes that literary tradition is a continuum. The new authors are only part of this tradition. They cannot break away from this tradition because the past creative efforts live in the present. Now, the present continuously transforms itself into new creative efforts, and the present also becomes the efforts of the past. So, it is a continuous cycle. So, it is the historical sense that compels a poet to write with an awareness of the present as well as with an awareness of the whole of literature, starting from the ancient classics, from Homer. So, in this essay, what Eliot tries to do is to attempt at a reconciliation, to reconcile tradition and the individual talent. So, Eliot says that this can happen only when writing becomes the process of reconciliation and interrelation of the past and the present the timeless and the temporal, the permanence and the change, the knowledge and experience, and the ideal and the real. Eliot advances his theory of depersonalization or theory of impersonality of poetry to assert the relevance of objectivity in literature. According to Eliot's theory, there is no connection between the poet's personality and the poem. So, this is his concept of individual talent. Eliot elucidates this by examining first the relation of the poet to the past, and second, by examining the relation of the poet to the poem. Now, poetry is basically impersonal for two reasons. First, the poetry is impersonal because the poet submits himself to an impersonal power outside him, and this power is tradition. So, what happens is that while a poet writes a poem, a continual self sacrifice occurs, a continual extinction of his personality. Now, the second reason why poetry is basically impersonal is that the poem does not express the personality of the poet. So, he is against the romantic concept of art or poetry as self expression. He is against the subjective nature of art. And Eliot uses an analogy from chemistry to, as an example, to explain this further, to explain the objectivity of art. So he says that the mind of an artist should be like a catalyst. So the mind is only a medium in which impressions and experiences combine in peculiar and unexpected ways. So the creative process happens inside the mind, but the mind should remain unaffected like a catalyst. And an example given is of a chemical reaction in which sulfurous acid is produced, and in that chemical reaction, platinum filament is used as a catalyst. Now, what happens is that the sulfurous acid has no traces of platinum at all. So, this is how a creative process should be. The mind of a poet should only be a receptacle that stores feelings and images which can unite to form a creative product. The mind of the poet, therefore, according to Eliot, is the shred of platinum. It remains unaffected, inert, neutral, and unchanged. Now, Eliot says that the more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and the mind which creates. So, for Eliot, a poetic composition is an impersonal process involving the poet's creative and critical faculties while surrendering his personal emotions. Now, Eliot rejects the romantic notion or the romantic definition of poetry as emotions recollected in tranquility. The man who suffers and the mind that creates are separate entities. So Eliot defines poetry as not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. Now, this essay, The Tradition and the Individual Talent, concludes thus. Eliot says that the emotion of art is impersonal, and the poet cannot reach this impersonality without surrendering himself wholly to the work to be done. Now, let's take a look at two other concepts for which Eliot is famous. Eliot's concept of the objective correlative is also closely related to his theory of impersonality of poetry. Now, he explains this concept, objective correlative, in one of his essays titled Hamlet and His Problems. He tries to explain how emotion is best expressed in poetry. He says that emotion is not transmitted directly from the poet's mind to the readers. So, the only way of expressing emotion in the form of art is by finding an objective correlative. Now, what does this mean? It just means a set of objects, a situation, a picture, a place, or a chain of events which shall be the formula of that particular emotion. So, objective correlative means something concrete, something that can evoke the same emotion in the readers. So, in this essay, what he tries to prove is that he says Hamlet is an artistic failure for lack of objective correlative. Hamlet is dominated by an excessive emotion that is not adequately objectified in the play. Now, the best example of an objective correlative is the sleepwalking scene in Macbeth. So, to convey the full sense of Lady Macbeth's mental anxieties, Shakespeare makes her repeat a few actions, do over and over again. She imagines that she is washing her hands and so on. So, this unconscious repetition of her past actions is the objective correlative of her present mental agony. The agony is made objective here. Another critical term proposed by T.S. Eliot is the dissociation of sensibility. Eliot says that poetic sensibility should be a unified sensibility that refers to the poet's capacity for a direct apprehension of thoughts. Shakespeare had this ability in abundance, and so did John Donne. But in the late 17th century, there occurred a dissociation of sensibility in English poetry. Poets lost their ability to transform thought into feeling. Milton and Dryden were mainly responsible for this. The Victorian poetry of Tennyson and Browning also reveals this failure. They lacked unified sensibility, or they had what Eliot refers to as a dissociation of sensibility. There is a split in thought and feeling. Now, Eliot says that Tennyson and Browning think, but they do not feel their thought as immediately as the odor of a rose. On the basis of this concept, Eliot pulls down Milton from his exalted position and installs a relatively unimportant and insignificant poet, Donne. Thus, Eliot makes a radical reevaluation of English literature and rewrites the map of English poetic tradition. To Eliot, the basic function of criticism is the elucidation of works of art and the correction of taste. The critic's approach here has to be objective if he is to achieve this. The critic must simply elucidate. The reader has to arrive at the correct judgment himself. True criticism means a scientific enquiry into a work of art to see it as it really is. Eliot deals with the nature and role of criticism in other essays also. For example, like The Function of Criticism, Frontiers of Criticism, and The Perfect Critic. He performs the critic's task of reforming and correcting the literary taste of his era. T.S. Eliot is one of the most influential 20th century literary critics whose concept of poetry as an entity with its own autonomy has strengthened the view that a poem is a verbal structure with its own independence and individual meaning. He is regarded as the forerunner of new criticism. Summing up the properties of Eliot's criticism, George Watson writes, "An Eliot essay is a statement of an attitude." I hope you found this video lecture on T.S. Eliot as a literary critic useful. Thank you so much for your patient listening.